So I've been reading this book, Judge Sewell's Apology, about the current topic of the Salem witch trials. It is a history book, and as you might imagine, we, as the Congregational Church, have ties that go back and back all the way to the Puritans in New England, and ties to this truly terrible moment in its history, with the Salem witch trials of 1692. In the Salem village in Massachusetts, a few girls were bored at home and trying to figure out what their future husbands would be like, and then proceeded to be thought to be possessed. And instead, they accused others of spiritually attacking them through demonic forces. This community was fearful enough and superstitious enough that these waves of accusations moved forward until more than 200 people were accused. And in the course of less than a year, 20 people were put to death before it was finally put to a stop by the governor of Massachusetts. And these trials were done with official trials, as the church and the state got mixed up in these questions about spiritual possession. And so who presided at these trials but a panel of 9 judges, one of whom was Samuel Sewell. And 5 years later, he publicly apologized. It was 5 years later in 1697, and in the midst of an official witchcraft fast in Massachusetts, and he apologized. He wrote it in a paper that he then handed to the minister on his behalf to read as he stood before those gathered, and it read like this. Samuel Sewell, sensible to the reiterated strokes of God upon himself and his family, and being sensible that as to the guilt contracted upon the opening of the late commission of Oyer and Terminer at Salem, he is upon many accounts more concerned than any he know of, and desires to take the blame and the shame of it, asking the pardon of men, especially desiring prayers that God, who has unlimited authority, would pardon that sin and all his other sins, personal and relative, according to his infinite benignity and sovereignty, not visit the sin of him or any other upon himself or any of his, nor upon the land, but that he would powerfully defend him against all temptations to sin, for the future vouchsafe the efficacious saving conduct of word and spirit. And after those words, he bowed his head before those gathered of every class and station. There were others who apologized or recanted their role in the witch trials, and they fall into many of the things that we as humans often do when we try to apologize and don't quite own what it is that we did was wrong. As one of the community leaders and pastors apologized, but added that he had done as he apprehended as to duty. However, through weakness and ignorance, I may have been mistaken. You think? Apologies from the accused often said that they were unwittingly an instrument of the devil, or used adverbs like ignorantly and unwittingly, which, for the record, is never terribly helpful in an apology. And of the 9 judges who presided at these trials, which we can see now was a profound perversion of justice, Judge Sewell was the only one to apologize and not try to excuse his behavior. How does a person do that? I've been reading this book in part because I've been trying to think what it would take to have been so completely wrong. to participate in something that is so unjust, and then be able to take the information into your mind to change your mind. That instead of just receiving information that justified yourself or added to your own defensiveness, but instead to come to the growing realization of how your actions had profoundly harmed another. How to take responsibility for that without minimizing the impact. What would it take to make an apology at that kind of a level? And I think of this in the wider world because I can come up with a pretty good list of people who really need to have an awakening. A pretty good list of people who really should take some serious time of reflection on how their actions impact others, and who I believe in their heart of hearts are actually profoundly wrong and actively working to harm God's beloved. And I have become concerned that they are so invested in these actions. I've worried that they have so acted in support of something for so long and so consistently that the cognitive dissonance it would take for them to imagine otherwise would be hard to overcome. So really, if they could get a whole lot better, that would be great. But as you can imagine, trying to time other people's spiritual awakenings is apparently not as successful as I might like. And it might perhaps instead be a better suited venture to look at the places where maybe once I might have been wrong. That maybe there's been a place that I have wronged others and where I might have the opportunity to apologize. We can say, I'm sorry a lot as like this social nicety that as we're walking past one another smooths the way of interactions. But the occasions for a real apology takes more thoughtfulness. From the accidental hurting of another's feelings, for the ways that our words can have an impact far beyond our intent, for the day-to-day interactions, the ways that we bump into each other in our close friendships and acquaintanceships all the way up, the ways that in the course of our lives we may have made choices that have harmed another. And in the course of our lives, we may have been wrapped up in these systems and stories where we benefit from another's harm. When we, along the way, inherit the responsibility to make things right. Because here's the challenge with apologies, is that you need to know your history. How you made choices, why you were making them along the way, and then you have to be able to see the new perspective and see how that was wrong. Hold both of these as belonging to you while holding your apology and the space for the person who is harmed. And if it falls into shame, so you're just crumpling in shame over this action, it means that you can't bear witness to the harm you've done. Somehow, if you fall into shame, it makes it all about you instead of where it should be, the person who's been wronged. Although it feels like you're doing something, falling into shame is not always an apology. And on the other hand, if it falls into defensiveness, blaming others, saying it wasn't you, you weren't in your right mind, or calling into question whether there was any wrong done in the first place, we know that's not an apology. Where it takes a lot to learn how to name that an action that you took harmed someone. to give them the space, if they would like it, to name what that experience was like for them, and to ask how you can make amends. To give them the space to forgive or not. Apologies come with all the messiness of human relationships. It is hard to apologize perfectly. And it somehow takes work not to make it about the person who is apologizing. I once had a housemate who had gotten into some spiritual community with very high control tendencies that encouraged him to apologize a lot. Exhausting, emotional, intimate, and very dramatic apologies. And after a year or so, after he had moved out, and around the fourth time he tried to dramatically apologize, I finally had to tell him I was no longer interested in hearing any more apologies from him. It takes a lot of emotional work to work through the process of reconciliation. In the scriptures that we read here for today, we hear apologies of different forms. The prayer to God in Jesus' story that is heartfelt and uncertain if it could even be heard. The story of Zacchaeus, the tax collector, who would have been notorious in his community for enforcing unfair Roman rule, collecting the taxes and probably a bit extra on the side. Zacchaeus meets Jesus and said he will give half of his possessions to the poor, and promises that if he has defrauded anyone, he will pay them back 4 times as much, which is good, except you would think that Zacchaeus would be in a position to know exactly how many he had defrauded along the way. These apologies, they're conversion stories between a before and an after, a harm and maybe a hope, a responsibility for what was, and maybe the grace to start again. And for us, being ready to learn how to apologize is learning how to be converted, to expand our compassion and viewpoint to include possibilities where we may have screwed up, where the harm of another is a part of our story and narrative, and to stand there in that moment and breathe and say, what does it take to be responsible here? To own what belongs to us and seek to apologize. For what does it take for us to look at even the land beneath our feet and say, how did this land and property that was under the care of the Duwamish and Coast Salish people for generations come to have our name on the title? Almost all this area of Bellevue was forests, which then were cleared with the dangerous work of removing the stumps for farmland, which was done by the Japanese community here in Bellevue, which was thriving and connected until the land ownership was stripped with the Japanese internment in World War II. There are stories that are deep. And what does it take to look with seriousness? What does it take to hold with responsibility? What part belongs to us here in this generation to be responsible and make things right? From the questions that are vast and systemic, all the way to our day-to-day lives and the ways that we can be wrong. Going back to our dear Judge Sewell, here are the things that I've learned about him. He loved his wife and grieved the many children he buried. He worried enough about his actions that he was afraid he had not made a thorough enough confession to join the church. He was an early opponent of slavery in the colonies, writing one of the first anti-slavery tracts in English, which was published in June 1700, which, if you're counting, is 76 years before the Revolutionary War and more than 160 years before this nation got its act together with the Emancipation Proclamation. He worked for the rights of people who were enslaved to become free and marry and keep families together from his seat as a judge. He also apparently thought that the subject of wigs, like those big puffy white wigs, was a source of moral outrage. He would claim that if we wanted to change the color of our hair from what God intended it, all was lost. Until he finally lost his own hair and had to wear a hat for the cold. And after his wife died, his accounting of future court trips was so ridiculous that it could count as comedy. In short, he was a full, ridiculous, complex human life, with the power for incredible good and the incredible power to harm, and all of that complexity mixed together. Because he was in a position of power, the ways that he could be wrong could cause profound harm. And you know that he could have imagined that he could have said, I was just one of 9 that was there at the time. I was an unknowing instrument of evil. But instead, he took the blame and shame upon himself and asked for pardon. In that way, that is powerful, like all apologies that are true are, and a way that also is clearly not nearly enough. Because the thing that takes the gap between the wrong and the apology and the other side, that is grace. That is a gift. Because as much as I look back, I want to divide the world into good guys and bad guys, and the ones who are perfect and the ones who are villains, I find how shocking it is that I don't fit neatly into one side. That in the right circumstances and the right way, we all could be capable of profound harm, and that the hope of forgiveness is that how the story starts doesn't need to be how it ends. That there is the chance that we could still turn and change. To name that we did something wrong and hold a space of reconciliation and amends, and that sometimes on the other side there is forgiveness and a new start and a new way. It's why I'm grateful that we gather today at this table. A table of grace and of reconciliation. This is a table where we are loved all the way through. You do not need to apologize for who you are. You are loved, welcomed, beloved, and full. We come to this table from all of the messiness of human life. The ways that we harm one another, the ways that we are in the midst of histories that go back and back but are ours now. Ours to have the chance to make a new beginning, to make a new start, to open a place where forgiveness might be possible. For as Jesus sat around at table with his disciples, with his friends, with those that would harm him too, he took the bread and, giving thanks for it, broke it and gave it to them, saying, "Take and eat. This is the bread of life given for you." And in the same way, he took the cup and, giving thanks for it, gave to them, saying, "This is the cup of the new covenant sealed in my blood. As often as you drink of it, doing so in remembrance of me." I pray, O holy God, that you might rest upon this bread and this cup. You who invite us into tables of reconciliation. You who invite us into tables of new hope, and you who give us a promise of a future where all of humanity is gathered at peace, in love, in truth, justice, wholeness, and mercy. May this meal be fuel for our journey, be sustenance for our way, taste of the hope and promise that we find in you. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. With hope and grace, come and receive this meal.